So basically, I'm in the final stages of Electra design right now, which is it's really exciting. It's also difficult because I feel like I've been working on it forever. It's been just under a year since I realized that in order to make a dating game, I needed to come up with a way to handle conversation. Initially, I was just like, okay, I'll just get a bunch of you say this, they say that in response. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, I don't like it. I started reflecting on my own experiences with dating sim games and how almost all conversation systems in games are not, or at least for me personally, were not to the level of enjoyment and experience that I was hoping for, that I wanted them to be, that I was wishing for them to be. And so here I am a year later, way down the rabbit hole. You would not be wrong to say that the Electra system has completely taken over the majority of the development and stole the stage away from some of the other mechanics going on in the game. It's really, really exciting, and it's only gotten more exciting the more time that I've put towards it and towards thinking about the ideas and concepts that need to come to life through it. But, so all that hype said, I'm finally getting close to being done. For the fourth time. This is the fourth time that I've tried to build an editor. So the theory has been more or less consistent for a while, which is that you have many different ways you can say one thing, and then you have a couple different things you can say, and at least at a given time. And those tone options allow for a whole level of micro that hasn't existed in almost any that specifically has never existed in any conversation system, where there are nested in tones of saying the same exact thing. Different dialogue options, sure, and maybe different tones, but the tones are actually saying basically different things usually. Especially in the games in which cutscenes play out after you select an option, like, so here's what you chose. It's like, oh, okay. So this system has that. What has changed is the tools for writers and creators that want to take part in the conversation, content creating. For the main game, a small team and me will be developing those, but in the long term, any user can use the tool. And I'll be opening that up to a beta very soon. But back to the short term, me and a small team of writers, which the auditioning process would just be that I pay them a small amount of money to start using the tool. And if I like both what they create and their ability, to use the tool, which I think is a big part of, kind of getting the job, then I'll try to persuade them to stay on and keep writing more for the conversation system. Really exciting. But what I've been working on is just making the tool better for them, and so I don't feel too bad when I talk about how I'm not going to pay them very much, at least in the initial phase of auditioning. Something, because I think anyone who's putting work into the conversation system in the early stages, the game is relatively content bare. So there's that, and then also I don't want to immediately judge what is a good or not a good conversation file before they've basically been any. So I'm going to keep everything in the short term, hire selectively, but I don't feel too bad about not that is a main topic of conversation, but I don't feel too bad about knowingly putting forth that I'm not going to pay them very much in the short term, because of how much work I've been putting in to give them a great tool to work with. I think that, when you think of writing, you're like, okay, Microsoft Word, or like maybe if like it's a screenplay, you have a tool that will have all kinds of drop downs that you can preset in order to organize your characters and stuff like that. I've messed with like Celtex a while ago, and I'm sure there's many better tools than that. But this is writing tools for dynamic conversation, so it's writing a lot of extra dialogue so that a system can handle being different just about every time and still tell a compelling story with specifics. So I don't feel too bad because I put so much work into this. Is the fourth time, and this fourth time specifically, I thought that it was at a good enough stage for the writers to start using it, and two different writers kind of came back to me and were like, I think I understand what the goal is here, but using the tool is terrible. Like, it was slow, and the progression is kind of invisible. You can't really understand what's going on until you plug it into the game. And if, in order to like quickly test your file, you have to export it and load it into the game and launch the game in VR every single time, it's a challenge enough to write great dialogue. Even more of a challenge to write great dynamic dialogue that can go many different ways. And I would dare say an impossible challenge after I reflected upon some of that feedback more. An impossible challenge to write great narrative, dynamic dialogue when the testing, the time from writing to testing takes like 10 minutes. Like, that's kind of unacceptable to a degree in which you would have to have a pretty incredible devotion to start working on something that you wouldn't even understand for a while. So I've taken that feedback to heart. I really have, and I basically went back to the drawing boards and like, okay, well, what were some of the ideas that I had or can have to fix that? And what I came up with was what I call the Galaxy Viewer within Electra, which at first was an optional kind of window that you could toggle on and off. But the more I thought about it, the more I was like, no, it's not possible to navigate exponentially branching in multiple order dialogue. It's not impossible to understand what's going on or write for it at all unless you can see the flowchart. So it's a nested flowchart, and you really won't get a great idea until you jump into the tool and try to use it yourself. But I'm getting very close to finishing all that, and one of the processes of that is, again, looking for feedback, and anyone who attempted to use the old tool definitely sees a massive improvement and actually can start to intuitively visualize, or not intuitively, they're not doing the visualizing, they're looking at the visuals, they intuitively recognize what's going on. So that's great. But there's still some things to fix. Still adding in some deleting functionality, and a couple other things that shouldn't be too much. But one of the main things is this isn't just a dialogue system in which you have multiple choices that can go many different ways and many different tones. Also, you can choose from many different options at many different times. There is absolutely no linear branching at all. Like, so in linear, you have no choice. Linear branching, you will come to a certain choice at a certain time in the game, chronologically, like you're on the timeline, and you can branch to a different timeline. Non-linear choice, and I've got to come up with a better, I think it's better, it's more in the realm of universe branching than linear branching or anything like that, but in this case, you can choose what your topic of conversation is, at least the root topic, at any time, which adds a whole level of strategy, and because all of your previous conversations compile to impact your future conversations. So yeah. How do you visualize something that can start from almost any place and can end at almost any place? How do you show that progress, piece to piece, and etc. And so my choice to this point has been, okay, you just highlight things. You highlight the crap out of things. You got a lot of boxes, you highlight the one that's active. And granted, I did not go nearly as far in the highlighting side of things as possible. Like, the highlight was more subtle than it could be. I probably could have done a highlight and an outline of like the different graphics that you're on to show what you're selected on. But it still wasn't really getting across because there's a lot of graphics going on with the nesting and the sub-menus. It gets pretty messy. So I'm returning to the idea of, well, I want a tool that not just allows you to scroll over what you've got, all the different dialogue options, but represents an accurate simulation and gives you all the information you wish you had to really know what's going on. So right now, at the moment, there's a system that's kind of called live mode, in which you select a dialogue tone as the player would. You select that, and the live mode does the calculation, okay, based on all the variables, what will the AI say? And they will always say that if those variables are the same, and you can kind of test what variables, would kind of put you over the edge for different replies, assuming there's multiple replies set up. Oh, that's an interesting idea. What if one of the settings on that editor is to show you a whole range of acceptable parameters? I'll get to that another time. I'm sure that doesn't mean anything to anyone. But anyways, context being all the variables that go into it, including the dialogue tone choice. So I was working with that. There's a live mode and a non-live mode, which is better for editing. So you want to set up all the different replies, and then you want to test for whether it's possible given what contexts. But that gets pretty confusing. So what I'm going to add is a kind of a home object that represents the start of a conversation. And at first I was like, okay, maybe you can kind of collapse a bunch of conversations and then use that as the basis for your context. But that gets kind of unwieldy. So for example, in the game, you could be talking to one girl once a day, maybe like 20 chunks, so 20 exchanges. You say something, she says something. That's 20 chunks each day for like 10 days. So now you've got 10 conversations worth of accumulated relationship. Now, given many, many variables, if you could control all those variables, and many of the variables would be hard to control in the game, such as your social status with all girls, a lot of them are a lot more fluid. Nothing is random chance, but yeah, a lot of things are more fluid. So assuming you can control those variables, you know for a fact, as the creator, as the content designer, using Electra, that will happen every time. And that reliability is important as a developer, because you need to know what you've created, what kind of a trap or a gift you've set up for the player. What mixture, what do they need to generally accomplish. So that exists in that, that was the game plan, was going to exist in that you would basically collapse many conversations, and then you could simulate what the player's relationship was. But actually, I think what I'm going to do is allow the user to hard set all those preconditions, which would be an accumulation of in-game activities, such as doing things that earns them a social status or reputation, among all the variables tracked. And there's a lot of variables. A lot of them are smaller impact, but There are a lot of variables, but giving the user in Electra, the content creator, the ability to hard set that, using a sort of a home graphic, and then they can branch into a new conversation given that premise. So, giving the user the kind of the premise tool. Yes, I think that's what I would call it. Here's the premise, and then through that would add a massive animated highlight over top of all the conversation kind of chunks that are selected, that would be selectable, and then the replies that result from that. And then at the end of wherever you want the conversation to end, for that, I guess you could say, that conversation that you have with the AI in that moment, to the point of saying goodbye, I guess, or wherever you want to leave it off. Maybe it's the time constraint, she has to leave, you have to leave, or something like that. Then there would be a output or a result. So you have your premise and your result as graphics you can interact with and see all the properties. And then the more I got to think about this, I was like, oh wow, this is actually a great feature. Because think a metaphor for this would be so in League of Legends, they released a practice tool where you could give yourself a bunch of gold and teleport around and try out different items really, really quickly, rather than having to play basically a full game every time you want to test out a full build. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of damage. That's a lot of time to test one thing, and that's if you control for a lot of factors such as experience, and that's a lot to keep in mind. So the feature that I'm talking about, the premise and then the result, is as if you in League of Legends practice tool, if there was a feature where you could pause time right after you hit someone with an auto attack, like pause on auto attack damage hit or something like that, and so the game pauses when you auto attack as like an ADC, maybe level 1, and then you can literally during that pause you can swap out all the different items that you could possibly have in that situation, all the different items. And then see what the result, which is the damage. So wouldn't that be a really incredible tool, even relative to the practice tool, like with Ezreal back when you could have an item that would do a bonus damage equal to like a percentage of your base damage, and there was another item that would increase your base damage. So you just buy 5 of those base damage increasing items, and then you could do like a bunch of extra bonus damage. So to compare that with a different item, you'd have to buy all the things, do the auto attack, then sell all the items, and buy the whatever other items you want to compare it to, and then do another auto attack and remember. So this tool, metaphorically, would be like you buy all those items, you do the auto attack, and then the game pauses, and then it also gives you a little readout number like 600 damage. You remove all your items, and then it will like automatically updates it to be like, oh, now without any items you do 200 damage, and then you buy a bunch of different items, oh, you do 530 damage, oh, that's less, but it has armor penetration. It's like, oh, if you buy all these other items, yeah, it only does 400 damage, but you also lifesteal back like 200 health, like, oh, so you can actually compare all the different outcomes. So for example, in Electra, there's a couple different like output parameters that the player is going to be aware of. One of them is your relationship familiarity. Like basically, in general, the more you talk to someone, the more familiar you get, which has kind of a interesting arc of effect on the player. Initially, there's kind of some first impressions where you have more impact on some aspects of your relationship, but also tend to be where most personalities will give you more slack to mess up or be awkward. In the middle, it's more of a testing grounds for romance. But anyways, one of the output properties is spark, which is her sexual attraction to the player. So that seeing all the different replies and what impact they have on that as you go through, even separate from your relationship, whether it's familiarity or like your likableness, you could say plenty of guys in real life have the problem of having a very high likableness in a relationship, but very low sexual attraction. Or at least the female's view of them is they're not very sexually attracted, but they do like the guy a lot. And sad as that is, that's not, or interesting as that is, it's not what a lot of guys are looking for if they're trying to date the girl, is not to be liked but not loved. And I use the love in a vague sense here, not necessarily that love equals sexual attraction, but I would say I think you need some of that in order to get started in a relationship. I think that makes sense, especially in a dating simulation game. Now, in this game, we are going with the premise that any girl in the game is possible to date within a realistic presence, like all seemingly attractive or at least close females within an appropriate age range would be dateable. So that premise means that it must be possible for them to be attracted to you. And so, given that possibility, it makes a lot of sense to drive that attraction through choices the player can make, which does not include their physical appearance. I guess there's the whole gym thing, but ignoring that, the physical appearance that they can't control, that can't be a factor in the game. So instead, a lot of what drives their sexual attraction to you is your personality types, which I think, in a stereotypical way, is more true to real life. There's plenty of guys who are really ugly or overweight who girls at least choose to date. I mean, I guess finding sexually attractive is kind of a subjective thing. You can't really know what's going on in anyone's mind other than what they tell you, and they could be lying, which there are plenty of situations in which you would want to lie. But anyways, we have to take some of those factors out because it's not a player choice, and thus this game is about skill. So if it's not skill-based, for more or less, it shouldn't be in the game. At least that is one of the design principles we have with this game. The premise must be possible. Maybe that would be a phrase that I repeat a lot, but yeah, the premise is possible. The premise must be possible. Which also makes me realize that as a debugging tool, if you have a premise, the premise needs to be achievable. So maybe there would be hard locks on what your premise on what the premise of certain sliders. So for example, if one of the premises is spark, and the only way, and spark means sexual attraction, the girl's sexual attraction to the player, if spark can only be generated according to her personality type by saying mean things, some girls like being teased or insulted. That's a whole other conversation, but some girls do like that. Not all girls, some girls. If that's the only way to get her into you, then in order for you to have a premise, which is like these sliders that you're moving around before giving the player, simulating what the player could choose, in order to have a high spark, there needs to be conversation chunks that have mean options. So you could not have a premise in the Electra system where you start out the conversation with 100% sexual attractivity. Like, you make a move and she's into it. You can't do that unless it's possible for the player to achieve that premise. Unless there's, maybe you get 10 points of spark every time you say something mean, unless there's 10 times where you can say something mean. And that's something the player could have said. Unless that's possible, it will kind of block that or lock it. Maybe you could unlock it and it would give you some warnings, but that would be another thing, another tool that could work. And to anyone who's listening who's like, well, what the hell is going on? You will understand when you get a chance to play with Electra if you haven't. These factors are crucial to using the tool effectively and enjoying it. I think that's one of the other pivots for the tool is before it was functional, it was a kind of a hotkey. Hotkeys aren't super fun to use. Games are in many ways kind of like hotkeys for work. You press a button to shoot the gun, that is basically triggering a bunch of different actions. Having the gun, holding the gun, and having it loaded and having it aimed somewhere. I guess it's a little bit more passive, but it's a shortcut. So games are shortcuts, and Electra started out as a shortcut, but not a game. Now Electra's turning into a game where you can you're really designing. You're designing content, but it should be enjoyable, and I think a big step is being taken to make it enjoyable using premise and results to get immediate feedback. You know, take the guessing out of the designer. You need to know what you're creating for the player as best as you can before you actually go out and test it or have players test it. But anyways, very exciting. I'm really excited to add that feature. I think it's going to be amazing. Still trying to figure out what the graphics will be. Maybe the premise will be sort of like a home or like a home base kind of icon. I'll be working on that, but I'm really excited. All right, have a good day.